Welcome back to the Beginner's Garden podcast. We are continuing our conversation with Peter and Rebecca. Peter is from the Garden Family, and Rebecca is from Happy Heart Gardens. Peter gardens in Southwest Ohio, Zone 6B, I believe he said, and Rebecca gardens in Southern Alabama, Zone 9A, if I remember correctly. Anyway, so we're talking about gardening from north to south and how it differs depending on where you're located. I'm in Arkansas, Zone 8A, but on the border of 7B, so I'm kind of in between the two. And today we're going to be talking about how daylight affects our gardens and also covering and why covers are important. I think it's so worth your time to be able to see how they garden differently because of their daylight and how it actually matters in a fall garden, and also how they use covers, and just some quick advice at the end for people who grow in climates similar to theirs. So let's welcome back on the show, Peter and Rebecca. Peter and Rebecca, thank you so much for joining me again for this podcast where we're talking all about fall gardening. I wanted to split this into two because I felt like this was a subject that I think we could talk about for probably a whole month of podcast, but just to be able to have some time to talk a little bit more about some of these subjects I don't really hear gardeners talk about a whole lot. And one of them is daylight. Peter, you mentioned that at the end of last week's episode. And so I'm going to go get with you in a second, Rebecca. For those of you guys who are just listening to this podcast episode, Peter's in Ohio, Rebecca is in Southern Alabama. So we've got very different garden seasons. I'm kind of in the middle here in Arkansas. But Peter, you and I are similar in that we do have what's called a Persephone period. If people aren't familiar with that, it's where your daylight dips below 10 hours a day, and that's generally believed to be where plant growth stops. And so that's something that shocked me because I was like, okay, it's still 60 degrees outside. Why aren't my plants growing? And then I realized it was the daylight. Peter, how does the daylight or lack thereof affect your plants, and how have you learned to adjust your plan around that?
Yeah, good question, and not talked about enough, like you said. So right around mid-November is when we drop um, below 10 hours. So lots of times you do your timing based on first frost, which I still think is a great way to kind of ballpark when to start things. But really, the hard stop for us, our first frost is around mid-October, but a month later, we don't really expect anything to mature past that point. So if something's already matured, let's say carrots, for example, we don't really expect the carrots to get bigger in the ground past November, mid-November, but they can stay in there. They're just not really going to grow. So working backwards, so much of fall gardening, like we talked about in the last episode, has to do with timing and making sure that you get a mature crop before you hit that point where it's just not going to mature anymore. So just to reiterate our timing here in Southwest Ohio, Zone 6B, we really need to get brassicas, so broccoli, cauliflower, those sort of things, in the ground by early August so that we can harvest them somewhere around the end of October.
Yeah, so that at least that they are fully mature. And if you have an Indian summer, so to speak, where you have warmer weather, you don't have to harvest them, which is one beautiful thing about the fall for me anyway, is in the spring, once those broccoli heads start forming, we've just kind of been talking about broccoli a little bit. I got to get them out or they're going to start bolting or they're going to not be great quality. But in the fall, it's not like that. As long as they don't hit too much of a hard freeze, then it's like my grocery store is outside my door. So but the main thing is getting them mature before those daylight hours dip below 10 hours. Rebecca, I want to ask you this question because I've had a lot of people ask me this and I haven't really known precisely how to answer. And my question would be, if you don't get less than 10 hours of daylight a day, which I'm assuming you don't have a Persephone period, your crops are going to continue growing through the winter. How do you know, or how does that affect your crops? Because you're still getting shorter days. It's not like you're on the equator.
Okay.
It's not the same.
So moving from way north Pennsylvania to South Alabama, I did notice that we don't have the huge seasonal changes as far as like the time change goes. We have sunlight for a lot longer, being a lot closer to the equator. But I still think I'm sure that affects the fall garden with some vegetables not getting like optimal size. And that could just be my own gardening issues, but
So, how long would you say that your shortest day is? Do you know the answer to that?
I don't. I don't think that we really get below 10 for very long, though. It's pretty consistent.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, we only get below 10 for like from mid November to mid January. So it's only like 8 weeks, I would say, that we get below 10. And you're much further south than us. And I know I've talked to people that live southern Texas, even in Louisiana, that they don't get below 10, but still getting. Getting 12-hour days versus what we get in the summer, 16, 18, makes a big difference in plant growth. So I know that you had told me before that like your cabbages don't get as large. And you just notice kind of a slower growth in general, but that doesn't mean that you have a hard stop like Peter does. So you're able to grow, like they're able just to continue to grow through the winter, most of them, right?
Yes, exactly. Yep. And it may just be the way that the sun is tracking over my garden with the trees and stuff, because I'm sure that changes as the season goes. So it may just be, like I said, a specific garden issue with me because I do have some shade.
Okay, so even in the winter you have some shade.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, I think that would make a difference too. Do you notice that if you have, this is something that I've wondered before and people have asked me, is if you have something like beets or carrots or even broccoli and they grow and they make it through the winter, are they, and let's say they're not completely mature yet, do they start maturing and start bulbing up like for your root crops or for cabbage heads when the daylight gets longer, because the daylight starts getting longer, at the end of December? Or do they have a tendency to bolt because they think it's their second season? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. No, I struggled definitely with bolting. I had some Napa cabbages that bolted, I think in like maybe January, February.
Okay. So that is a risk there. If
Mhm.
they are able to overwinter, once it gets much longer days and warmer, you would have to be careful to harvest them quicker.
Yes. Hmm.
Okay. Um, Now, what about covers? We talked about this in last week's episode, that we were going to talk about covers and how important that is. Peter, I think I remember seeing on Instagram with your garden last year that there was a point that you ended up shutting it all down. Do you ever try to overwinter? Are you able to overwinter, or like what do you do as far as when you decide maybe you're done?
Yeah, so there's garlic. We always overwinter, right? So that's a
Mhm.
fall crop. There are gardeners. I haven't done it, but there are gardeners that overwinter onions. And the risk there is just having them bolt, as you alluded to. If they think they're in the second season, they're just a little bit more likely to bolt. But I've known people that overwinter onions. As far as other plants, there's carrots that we forget to harvest, and if we have a really mild winter, sometimes they're still there. That's pretty rare. Uh, a big part of it is really just selfish in that I actually like the fact that I stop gardening in November, and then I get really excited to garden next spring because I've had a break.
Yeah.
And if you remember from the last episode, I'm from Santa Barbara, California originally. You never really have that break, and I just think it's really fun to have a break and then get excited about it, because we start our onions in January.
Mhm.
So you know we have a break from November and December, and then we starting seeds in January, and then a lot of seeds in February and early March. So
So you basically choose not to overwinter and work really hard to be able to overwinter because of that break. I mean, there's some things obviously you wouldn't be able to even with all the covers, but I mean, you hear about gardeners like Elliot Coleman that talk about everything you can grow in the winter. You just choose not to. Is that what I hear you say?
yeah, I actually, if you go on our social media page, I do wood carving also. So it's kind of my
Yeah.
time to say, hey, I'm going to put everything to rest, take a garden break. And then when you get those seed catalogs, you're just so excited because you haven't done it, for a little while. So I do really enjoy having the break. We do use row covers, and they're actually pretty essential, I think, for fall gardening. But we don't try to insulate everything, with double poly and everything to try to get things overwintered.
What do you use row covers for then if you're not trying to overwinter?
All right, so fall gardening, I mean, I think you almost need to use row covers to not be frustrated with fall gardening. So if you remember our timing, we're planting out in August, early August. It's usually about 90 degrees. And here you have a little broccoli seedling that's been in a climate controlled 70-degree basement. And now you have to plant it out into the heat of August. So all my plants are planted out under 30% shade cloth initially. And then actually the brassicas themselves get every row cover we have because they also always have insect netting right away. So they get planted out with insect netting to prevent cabbage worms, 30% shade cloth. And that usually stays on the whole month of August. I do monitor if we get cooler days, usually at the most low 80s, high 70s ideally. I take the row covers off because one of the things we talked about was sunlight is at a premium because the days are getting shorter. So we do want to try to get them as much sun as possible without frying them. And then September is usually kind of the golden month where things start cooling down, and the only thing on it is the netting to prevent the cabbage worms. And then by October, now they get frost cloth, which does double duty. It prevents the cabbage worms and kind of mitigates those really cold nights. Even though they can survive into the high 20s, they really don't like it very much. So usually once we get into the low 30s at night, that's when we have the frost cloths on.
I have noticed that too, that some of these crops can make it, but that doesn't mean they're happy about it. Or they can make it through one hard freeze, but that second one they really show damage. Whereas the cover can help extend how many freezes it takes for them to really show damage. But that's just what I've observed in my garden. It sounds like that's the way that you have observed those things too.
Yeah, absolutely. The high 20s without the frost cloth, I mean, your plant will still be there, but it's going to be pretty stressed and not
Yeah.
doing so well. So the one thing that's nice about the freezes is, the way plants deal with being able to withstand a freeze without all their cells rupturing is they actually transition a lot of the starch to sugar. And that's part of the reason why fall vegetables taste so sweet.
Yes, I have definitely noticed that. Rebecca, I'm going to come back to you on the covers because I know you use them as well, but do you get to benefit from the freezing weather as far as their effect on the taste of your crops in the fall?
Probably not as much as you guys do, no.
So you're getting frost, but you're not getting consistent freezes that starts to convert those starches to sugar as much.
Right, correct. Yeah. Although we are getting more frost, it seems like the last few seasons.
Okay. So what about the covers then? How do you use covers in your fall garden, especially if you just get occasional frost? Or do you mainly use them like Peter was talking about with shade cloth and insect netting, or do you use the frost cloths too?
I use all the things. Not so much the shade cloth in the fall, but just definitely the insect netting on the brassicas. And then also the frost cloth. I tend to get, because we are so mild, I get, over ambitious and I plant all the things everywhere. So then it's a scramble to cover. Where this year I'm going to be more mindful and sort of plant just in a couple designated beds. So it's a lot easier to cover. Even though these things can handle the frost. Being a plant mama, I get nervous. So even if it may not be, even if the plants could probably handle it, I tend to still cover if they say, we're going to get to like 32, 33, just because that's just my own craziness. But one thing I have learned in all of this is that the different frost cloth weights, which I think sometimes as a new gardener you don't think about. You just go on Amazon and buy a frost cover, but they do have different weights, for different temperatures.
You're saying that the weight of the frost cloth is important, and that's something I don't know that I know a whole lot about. I know Peter mentioned 30% shade cloth, but you're talking about the different weights of the frost cloth.
Correct.
Can you elaborate on what someone would be looking at? Because I just went on Amazon and bought what said to be a floating row cover, and that's worked fine for me. But how do you choose what you're gonna use?
Sure. So they're different. They'll have different weights. And then that will determine how much sort of like how many degrees of protection you're going to get. So obviously the thinner the fabric, you only get maybe 2 to 5 degrees of protection. So if you're going to be, 35, then it's going to, give you 5 degrees of that protection. So depending on where you're at and what you're covering or how low you're going to get, you're going to want to find, maybe that thicker, like a 2.5 ounce weight, which will give you like really 10 degrees of protection.
Okay, Peter, what do you use for that? Do you know?
I believe we use the 1.5 ounce one.
Okay.
It's the thinner of them, and like we talked about, I'm not really trying to extend my season a ton,
Mm-hmm.
and I also like the thin one because in the spring you don't need to zip it off of there as quickly and then put on the netting. You can keep it on for longer, just less back and forth, because as you guys probably do as well, we've got springs with wildly fluctuating temperatures, and if you have a thicker frost cloth on, you're going to have to run and take that off and then put it back on, and then back and forth. And I love gardening, but you want to make it as simple as possible.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't like having to go out and keep covering and uncovering because, I mean, even a sunny 50-degree day, if you have maybe not 50, I don't know, but all that to say, if you have a cooler day, but it's sunny and you have your whole bed entrapped in this greenhouse cloth that doesn't breathe very well, you could very much do some damage to your plants because they would get too hot. And so that's a good point as well. Rebecca, I'm sure, I don't even know, would you even call it overwintering the crops that you grow, or is it just a winter garden? At what point in your garden, do you switch from these are the crops that I planted in the fall to, okay, it's time to plant new ones for the next year?
You mean going from winter to like spring? Usually around like January, February. Like I'll plant onions mid-January. Then I'll plant out like tomatoes and peppers mid-end March.
So you're hoping to have your fall and winter garden harvested by
Correct. Yeah.
then.
Yeah. So I pretty much just go right from one to another.
Okay. Okay. So whereas Peter, you've got that hard stop, and are you doing something, Peter, on your garden when you take everything out to cover it for the winter, or like do you do mulch or cover crops or anything like that?
Yeah, so we've done both. So one thing you'll see if you go on our social media pages, you'll see we do a lot of straw bale gardening. I know you
Hmm.
do that too, Jill.
Yeah.
So um, and when the end of the season comes along, I take that opportunity to mulch a lot of the beds with the old straw. And then as far as cover crops, there's winter rye we've used in the past. There's actually a blend that Johnny Seeds does that works really well over the winter. The only thing about those is they do take a lot of effort to terminate. So I'm going to try to look a little bit more this season about getting on some of the summer beds where I'm not planting a fall crop, something that will winter kill rather than the winter rye, because the winter rye works great. It's got beautiful root structure. It's really, really nice. But if you're not spraying chemicals on it to kill it, which of course we're not. It takes a little effort to terminate it in the spring when you're really busy doing a lot of other gardening.
And are you doing that in raised beds or is that in ground bed?
Both, actually. Yeah.
Okay.
So just as an example, cover crop, it's not a fall cover crop, but it does transition to fall. So we had our garlic, which we harvest in June. Now, I could plant a really quick maturing crop, maybe bush beans there, but we didn't want to do that in that bed. And so I planted a buckwheat cover crop in the garlic bed, with the knowledge that it's going to get planted out in brassicas in early August. So have that 6-week period where, really ideally you have living roots in the ground the whole time. Those big summer rainstorms, if you have nothing growing in there, it's all going to leach out, all your nitrogen and everything in your bed. So actually just terminated that cover crop, and then I'll be planting my brassicas in there in early August, a couple weeks.
I think cover crops are something that I mean, I tried to do all the research ahead of time to learn it all before I planted my first one, and it was helpful. But I think with cover crops for me, it's been a matter of trial and error, figuring out what works, what doesn't, what's really hard to terminate, like you mentioned, and what actually works well. And I think also it depends on, I would choose a different cover crop for a raised bed than I would probably in the ground, in general. But I think that's something to consider for sure. But it sounds like you make really good use of your spent straw bales for mulch, which to me probably makes an amazing soil the next year because it's already been conditioned with all that nitrogen. So you have that ready-made bed almost just to be able to plant in when you get in your gardening groove again after shutting your garden down.
Yeah, for sure.
Rebecca, do you do any kind of cover crops, or do you just have to go from one season to another and you really don't have time for that?
No, I do some beds. I'll do cover crops. I don't necessarily do all beds, all vegetables all the time. And I also do, like I said, a late summer. I like to do, cowpeas. There's so many different varieties of cowpeas, and they make a great cover crop. Plus, of course, then you have the bean itself. And I've also done Austrian winter
Mhm.
pea, clover. It just depends what I had in that bed or what I plan on putting in the bed, that type of thing. So I do some cover crops in the winter as well.
Okay, that's good because I'm kind of picturing your garden because you have more of a mild climate of almost like spreading out a whole lot of crops throughout the whole season. So to be able to catch those times where you can put cover crops in. I was curious how you did that, but that makes a lot of sense. All right, I want to finish up here by asking you two each a question because there's probably someone, or I know there is, just because that's normal for someone that is in your climate who is new to fall gardening, that they want to try fall gardening for the first time this year. If you were talking to them right now and you would give them one piece of advice on what they could do to be successful if they're brand new at fall gardening, but they're in your climate, what would you tell them? And I'll start out with you, Rebecca.
Just go for it. Like think about like what you really want. Like if it's a lettuce, just get a small pot maybe, or use one of the beds you already have if you already are gardening, and just start small and see where it goes. Don't overwhelm yourself thinking I'm going to do this massive garden. Start small for your first time, I think, in the fall garden.
Okay. Peter?
Yeah, I want to reiterate what Rebecca said, starting small for sure. And then if you're in a northern climate, even if you're not super organized, you do have to be a little bit organized with the fall garden. So the biggest one is just setting some calendar alarms to start your seeds. So, like I said, it's the middle of summer. It's not something that you're going to be thinking about starting a cool weather plant in July. So set some calendars and get that timing right. And then, if you have a gardener that is already fall gardening in your area, talk to them about timing. Or if you follow along with people on social media, uh, just know that the region that you're following is really important. People are going to make a lot of videos about fall gardening and timing and things like that. If I made one when I still lived in California and someone in Ohio watched it, it would be pointless to watch. It doesn't really help too much unless it's region specific. And then just grow things that you like eating. That's the
Yeah.
other thing. It's no point in putting effort into something if you and your family don't want to eat it. So brassicas, carrots, beets, really good in the fall.
And I want to go back to something that you kind of mentioned a little bit, Peter, but I think it bears repeating that the way that you said that you learned how to grow in a fall garden was to see what you lost. And I think I love that answer because I think it's so true, but it's also very encouraging for someone to not feel like they need to load themselves up with expectations for their fall garden. And sometimes, I think I've mentioned this before, but sometimes even now, I will, like, if I have a whole broccoli stand and we're getting, on the border temperatures and I'm kind of nervous I might lose them, I'll harvest all except one and I'll see, does that one survive? Just to see like what's going to happen. And so I think not discounting the fact that learning through our fall and winter gardens is a process that takes time. And I'm sure that's the case no matter what climate we're gardening in. So for those of you guys who want to follow along with you two, share again where they can find you and where's the best way to follow along with your garden journey, especially as we head into the fall and winter. Peter, we'll start with you.
Yeah, like I said, I'm Peter. We are at The Garden Family, one word, on both Instagram and YouTube. And if you want to see how our fall garden does this fall, we're starting it. We'll be planting it very, very soon. So follow along, especially if you are in the Midwest area. And I'm happy to give you guys any tips that you need.
How about you, Rebecca?
Yeah, so I'm Rebecca at Happy Heart Gardens on Instagram. And like I mentioned, I'm in South Alabama. So I will be doing a fall garden, but not for a little bit yet. Although if you want to start seeds, you can start thinking about that if you're going to do your own seeds this year. So I hope you'll follow along. And like Peter said, please reach out anytime. I'm always happy to answer questions.
I've learned so much from you too. I love how you try different things. I love how you share variety of suggestions, things that you're trying. I think so much of what I've seen, especially on Instagram from both of you, has been so helpful. Just little tidbits, nuggets to learn along with you guys. And I'm just really thrilled that you made the time, despite the technical glitches we've had today, that you've made the time to chat about this. And I know it'll be helpful for so many people. So thank you guys both for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you guys. It's been great.
I hope you enjoyed these last 2 weeks of episodes with Peter and Rebecca. I hope you learned a lot, and I hope that it helped you when you're growing your fall garden. As always, I appreciate you joining us here on the Beginner's Garden podcast, and I hope you have a fabulous day and best of luck with your fall garden.